Thank you for joining us. My name is Father Aquinas Gilbo. I'm the University Chaplain and Vice President for Ministry and Mission here at the Catholic University of America. Campus Ministry is pleased to co-sponsor tonight's event with the Institute for Human Ecology, the Catholic Project, and the Center for Law and the Human Person. Allow me to share just a brief word about each of these groups. IHE is one of the nation's leading institutes committed to identifying the conditions conducive to human flourishing from an interdisciplinary perspective, bringing faculty from across the university, the country, and indeed the world here to Catholic University to think about these questions and issues that pertain to all of us. Campus ministry here at Catholic University provides spiritual formation and opportunities for worship, service, and community engagement for students across campus, allowing our students to grow deeper in faith and friendship at this important moment of their lives. The Catholic Project brings together clergy and laity to address the challenges that the Catholic Church faces in the U.S. The Catholic Project addresses accountability, transparency, evangelization, reform, and renewal. The facets of their work include education and formation, research, events, and media. And finally, the Center for Law and the Human Person at the Catholic University's Columbus School of Law provides a forum for the systematic study of the connection between the Catholic intellectual tradition and the legal tradition. The center supports relevant scholarship, curricular development, and student formation, as well as engaging broader academic, professional, and public policy communities. So we're grateful to all of these groups for bringing us together this night. Why don't we begin with a prayer? In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Heavenly Father, look kindly on our gathering this evening. Confirm us with your spirit of truth and console us with your spirit of love. Bless our guest, his family, and his work. May he enlighten our minds and stir our hearts to know and love the truth of creation, the truth of man and woman, the truth of marriage and family. Bless, too, our university, its faculty, staff, and students, and in particular the staffs and benefactors of the Institute for Human Ecology, the Catholic Project, the Center for Law and the Human Person, and campus ministry. May our work begin with your inspiration and by your grace reach a perfect conclusion to your greater glory, the good of the Church, and the flourishing of our university. We ask this through Christ our Lord. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. At this time, I would like to invite Stephen White, the Executive Director of the Catholic Project, to introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Father Aquinas. Thank you all for being here. I brought a life-size version so you can all see it with me for scale. We are very pleased to have with us tonight Professor Brad Wilcox, Professor of Sociology and Director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. Professor Wilcox is also a scholar with the Institute for Human Ecology here at Catholic University. He is the Future of Freedom Fellow at the Institute for Family Studies and a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Professor Wilcox is the author and co-author of 6 books. He has written for scientific journals such as the American Sociological Review, the Journal of Marriage and Family, as well as popular outlets like the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, and National Review. In his most recent book, which I'm going to make you sign for my wife later, Get Married, Why Americans Should Defy the Elites, Forge Stronger Families, and Save Civilization, Professor Wilcox studies marriage, fatherhood, and the impact of strong and stable families on men, women, and children. We're very grateful to have Professor Wilcox with us this evening to discuss these important topics. As a quick housekeeping reminder, Professor Wilcox will speak, and then afterwards we'll have a little bit of time for some questions from the audience. And following that, we invite you all to join us for light refreshments and a little reception afterwards. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Brad Wilcox.
Thanks, Stephen. It's great to be here at Catholic University tonight talking about the closing of the American heart. You kind of can see the title is now appearing up on the screen here. And I've got both bad news and good news to convey tonight. But I want to begin, though, just by talking about my own kind of home institution. I've been kind of living really in the shadow of Thomas Jefferson for more than 20 years, literally actually down in Charlottesville. His kind of home, Monticello, kind of sits over Charlottesville, just about 2 hours southwest of here. And of course, Jefferson is famous for many things, but I think especially for the Declaration of Independence and those words about the importance of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And tonight I want to think about that last phrase a bit, as we kind of move into this discussions about marriage, and kind of thinking about sort of how we're doing when it comes to the pursuit of happiness. And I would suggest to you tonight we're not doing very well when it comes to happiness in America. We've actually been seeing in a variety of different polls across the US indications that we're kind of hitting record lows here in America. So more and more American men and women are not realizing that kind of classic Jeffersonian pursuit, the pursuit of happiness in this moment in time. And I think that might be in part because, we're chasing perhaps the wrong things in this culture today. And in particular, what I'm thinking about is what I call kind of the Midas mindset. That more and more today, we're told by our ruling class in the media, in the academy, and the pop culture that we should steer a path away from marriage and family towards mammon, towards money, towards work, towards the unencumbered self in this context that we're living in today. Now, this kind of came apparent to me one night as I was finishing up the book, and there was a kind of a headline that was trending on Twitter in the fall of 2023 as I was wrapping up the book that said this from Bloomberg. It said that, quote, "Women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer." Okay, so again, women who stay single and don't have kids are getting richer, kind of giving us this sense that the path to prosperity runs away from marriage and family and not towards it for women. And not only did this article kind of make an argument about kind of the demerits, if you will, of marriage for women's finances, but it also kind of gave us the impression that the path to happiness for women ran, again, away from marriage and family and towards singleness. They profiled a woman who's pictured here named Ashley Marrero, who splits her time between high-end properties in Manhattan and the Jersey Shore. And she's not married, and she doesn't have any kids. And she is obviously, as it says here, kind of very happy with her life, as it is. So kind of giving us, again, the sense that, if you want to be both prosperous and happy as a contemporary woman, you should be kind of heading away from marriage and family and not towards it. And this Bloomberg message is by no means a kind of outlier in our public conversation today. We can see this headline from The Atlantic, making the case against marriage. There was a piece not too long ago in the New York Times that said that married heterosexual motherhood in America is a game that no one wins. Okay, again. Now, if I was to kind of just focus on the ways in which a lot of more left-leaning voices in the academy and in journalism are kind of giving us a pretty negative take on marriage, focusing on women, that's probably not particularly revelatory for this group tonight. But of course, what's also, I think, new in this moment in time is we're getting messages too from the right, from people like Andrew Tate, pictured here, who are kind of arguing to men that marriage is not a path to prosperity or happiness either. That men who want to be happy and men who want to be well off should be also kind of steering clear from marriage. In fact, Andrew Tate says that there is, quote, zero statistical advantage for men in terms of marriage. That's kind of his perspective on marriage. So we're just kind of seeing a lot of voices, particularly from the left, but also from parts of the right, kind of telling young adults today that the path to prosperity and happiness does not run through marriage. And this, I think, kind of mindset is also now filtering down among many ordinary adults. We can see data from Pew, for instance, kind of telling us that only 23% of adults think that marriage is kind of a central path when it comes to fulfillment. And by contrast, 71% think that a job or career that they enjoy is going to lead to a sense of happiness. So this kind of cultural shift, again, to a kind of more Midas mindset, I think helps to explain why we're seeing what I call the closing of the American heart unfold in today's culture. We see when it comes to marriage, for instance, that the marriage rates come down by about 60% here since 1970. To kind of make sense of what that means practically for an audience like this, what it means is that about 1 in 3 young adults today will never marry. Okay, so a lot of young adults today will kind of move through midlife and later life without the benefit of a spouse. And we've never kind of had this level of non-marriage kind of unfolding in the American culture. And then, of course, it's also related to dramatic declines in fertility. We're seeing American fertility rates hit about 1.6 right now. And again, we've kind of never had a fertility rate this low in America as we do kind of right now. And that means that about 1 in 4 young adults we're projecting will never have kids. Okay, so these are kind of, I think, 2 central indicators of the closing of the American heart that's unfolding in America today. Now, when you kind of talk about this issue in the academy, there's certainly some voices who will kind of minimize the importance of this dynamic. Eric Klinenberg is a professor of sociology at NYU, the author of Going Solo. And when he was kind of talking about this issue that we're seeing unfold in American life, kind of this decline in marriage, this decline in parenthood, he couldn't muster a negative word about the falling fortunes of marriage and family life in his interview with the New York Times. He said, for young professionals, it's a sign of success and a mark of distinction, a way to gain freedom and experience the anonymity that can make city life so exhilarating. And talking about kind of like the single life from his perspective. But forgive me, I think in a nation marked by rising economic inequality, in a society where too many of us are glued to our screens, addicted to the electronic opiates that make so many of us anxious and depressed, in a country where community is crumbling and loneliness is rising, and in a culture where fewer and fewer norms ground and guide our lives. It's in this context that I would suggest to you tonight that marriage and family matter more than ever for the welfare of ordinary women and men across the United States. So I'm thinking of, for instance, men like Scott. Scott is a young man who lives actually not too far from here in the kind of outer suburbs of Maryland. And by the standards of kind of like the Midas mindset, nothing should really be bothering Scott because he's got a graduate degree. He's got a good job working as a defense contractor. He makes 6 figures. But Scott is not flourishing. He's not doing very well. He says this, you know, I've got degrees in my wall. I've got accomplishments and certificates, but it doesn't mean anything in the end, is what he told me. It's not like I can take any of that with me after I die. Scott feels alone and at sea on many a day. Quote, I have to get up every day and look in the mirror and realize I'm alone. I have nobody. And he worries about the kind of fate that might await him if he should ever fall sick later in life. He says this, I have no help, you know. If something happened to me tomorrow, there'd be no one for me. So Scott's struggling with a kind of a toxic mix of loneliness, meaninglessness, and sadness. Now, to be sure, there are many single adults who are flourishing, as we all know here especially, and there are many married folks who are struggling, as we also know. But on average, the kind of story that Scott kind of gives us is emblematic of some larger patterns that we're seeing unfold across the United States today in connection with this closing of the American heart. We have new research from the University of Chicago economist Sam Peltzman, for instance, that tells us that most of the decline that we've seen in happiness in polling data can be kind of laid at the feet of this retreat from marriage we've been seeing unfold in the US, again, as this quote here tells us. So the bad news then tonight is that less marriage and fewer families is also linked to dramatic declines in happiness in America. I also can talk about, too, in the Q&A, ways it's kind of linked to increases in deaths of despair in the US and to kind of the stagnant character of the American dream. But that's the bad news. What's the good news, if any, that I have to convey tonight? Well, the good news is that, in part, I think, is that we're seeing more and more science kind of just keep mounting that tells us that marriage and family matter for kids and for adults in ways that are, I think, largely congruent with a lot of the assumptions that many of us here in this audience would hold about kind of the nature of marriage and family life. And we are seeing, at least in some outlets today, I think a kind of growing recognition that stable marriages matter both for kids and for adults. So I'm thinking, for instance, of recent pieces in The Atlantic on Melissa Kearney's book, The Two-Parent Privilege, that underlines the ways that marriage matters for kids up here on the left. And there's been a fair bit of coverage of my book, like this piece by Nick Kristof on the right, kind of underlining all the ways in which marriage matters for adults, for both men and for women. I think kind of a recognition, too, that marriage in particular is a powerful predictor of happiness. Not just that Chicago study, but my own work tells us that really nothing matters for ordinary happiness in this country like a marriage, especially a good marriage. And again, a lot of young adults today think that it's really about happiness, that is about your education, making a decent salary, or having a satisfying career. But the data from what's called the General Social Survey tell us that instead, simply being married is a better predictor of kind of succeeding at the pursuit of happiness than, again, how much money you make or how much education you have or how kind of satisfying your career is. And then in the GSS, nothing compares to the quality of your marriage as a predictor. So not things like money and career, sexual frequency, self-rated health, kind of no variable that I can kind of throw at the models is as powerful predictor as a high-quality marriage in the GSS. And this, I think, kind of makes sense because, we're social animals, as Aristotle noted, many, many years ago. We're hardwired to connect. And so our ties with others, with family and friends, ends up being crucial to our welfare because they afford meaning and direction and a sense of solidarity to our lives. Opportunities both to give and receive care across the course of our lives, and then also to grow in virtue. These are all things that tend to kind of redound to our satisfaction, to our sense of meaning, and to our happiness across the country. So that's, I think, kind of one set of good news about marriage. That is both in the academy and in parts of the media, there's a recognition of the ways in which marriage matters both for kids and for adults in the US. And then the second piece of kind of good news that I want to convey is that there are groups of Americans today who are kind of succeeding at forging strong and stable marriages. And I call them the masters of marriage in my book. Okay, so again, 4 groups of Americans who are kind of bucking the tide here and who are markedly happier for forging strong and stable marriages. And those 4 groups are Asian Americans, conservative Americans, strivers or college-educated Americans, and then the faithful. And I should note here, just as we're getting kind of close to the election, that when I first began this project, I anticipated just really 3 groups in this collection: Asian Americans, the strivers, and the faithful. But as I ran numbers with my colleague, Dr. Wendy Nguyen, we found over and over again that ideology was an independent and statistically significant predictor of marital, both success in terms of marital happiness and then also entering into marriage. So it just kind of tells us that, for better and for worse, in this moment that we're living in, ideology and politics have now become much more salient when it comes to sort of how people are approaching marriage and family life in contemporary America. But in kind of looking at each of these four groups and kind of thinking about some common patterns, what are some of the kind of secrets that I think their experience would tell us about, how to forge a strong and stable marriage in America today? And in terms of kind of just, big picture, I think one of the things that they often do is that they kind of either explicitly or implicitly recognize that family has to come first. And so they kind of reject some of the more individualistic contours and characters and currents in American life. Second that they realize is that there's kind of a way in which we have to kind of make a choice and reject the kind of, more, we have to kind of reject all the choices that we have in our current cultural context in favor of kind of a deep and abiding commitment. And the third thing that they do, I think, successfully is to recognize that not every kind of cultural development that comes down the pike should be embraced, and that there's a role and a place for tradition in their lives. And then more concretely, there are three kind of things I want to touch on tonight that are part and parcel of what I call kind of like the 5 pillars of strong and stable marriages. And those pillars in the book are communion, children, commitment, cash, and community. But in the interest of kind of keeping this conversation running quickly, I'll just touch on communion, commitment, and community tonight. So on the communion piece, I think we often kind of hear our elites and see our elites in print kind of stressing a kind of me-first approach to marriage that privileges autonomy, freedom, and self-interest, okay? And we can kind of see this in part when we look at how we are told to sort of handle our money. It's a kind of me-first approach to money that we often see our elites articulating. I'm thinking, for instance, of Susie Orman, the financial guru, that kind of recommending to couples that you have kind of a his and hers approach to money, separate accounts for both spouses, kind of her advice, in part, in the event that things, don't work out in one's marriage. But again, it's kind of emblematic of a more me-first approach to married life, and in this case, in the financial domain. But as I spoke to ordinary couples across the U.S., what I found is that couples who kind of took a rather different approach to money were more likely to be flourishing. I'm thinking of John and Maria Erickson, for instance. And this Catholic couple actually met in the 82nd Airborne, and they were getting ready to deploy to Iraq as they were engaged. And Maria went out to get some items for the two of them, for their deployment. And they included some expensive items like ballistic glasses. Quote, they were really expensive. Something like $160 is what Maria told me. And so when she brought these items back to John, she made it clear to him that she expected to be paid for these items. But John just kissed her on the forehead and said, what is yours is mine, and mine is yours, and now we're going to be married, and it's all going to be equal. So this kind of more we-first approach to money fuel a virtuous cycle in their marriage of communication, trust, and security that has served them well for more than 25 years of marriage. It also actually happened, too, to kind of help her get rid of her college and graduate school debts very quickly, because by pooling their money, they were able to pay off her debts very rapidly, especially because John didn't bring any debt into their marriage. And their experience is by no means an outlier. What we see in a survey that we did with YouGov is that in general, couples who have this kind of more we-first approach to money are markedly happier in their marriage, and they're less likely to be worried about divorce. As this figure up on the screen here indicates, the joint couples with joint accounts are in the top bars, and the couples with separate accounts are on the bottom bars here. And what's kind of fascinating about this particular point is we actually have new experimental evidence from Indiana University where they've randomly assigned newlywed couples to joint accounts, to separate accounts, and to kind of do as they please with their money. What they found was that couples who were randomly assigned to joint accounts were much more likely to be flourishing in the first 2 years of married life. So it's pretty powerful evidence that there's something about, again, this kind of we-first approach to money that is fostering stronger marriages today. And again, I think this approach to communion, where you are kind of taking this we before me approach, is helpful in fostering a sense of unity and teamwork and mutual service that are all kind of characteristics or ingredients for a strong and stable marriage today. So the second pillar that I'm going to touch on is commitment. And I think we are all kind of aware of the way in which our elites are often kind of discounting the importance of different kinds of commitment in today's culture. They've been doing that for a long time when it comes to marital permanence, right? The kind of till death do us part ethic. But this kind of effort to kind of discount the importance of commitment also now applies to even kind of monogamy and fidelity, as we've been seeing in the media really in the last 7 or 8 months. There's been a big push, for instance, for polyamory here in the New York Times, in the Wall Street Journal, in New York Magazine. There's even a new Paramount series called From Couple to Thruple that's kind of trying to advance this polyamory agenda. But again, as I've been kind of talking to ordinary couples across the US about their marriages, I've gotten the sense that husbands and wives who kind of don't embrace this newer approach are more likely to be flourishing. Consider a guy that I call Patrick in Central Virginia. Patrick is tall, he's handsome, he's well-spoken. He's in sales, he meets a lot of people, he plays guitar in a band on the side. Sorry, it's missing. And travels a lot. All factors that could boost his risk for infidelity. But he's intentional about protecting his marriage in real life. He says this: when I'm meeting new people in my line of work, I talk a lot about my wife and kids. I want them to know I'm a family man. He also is pretty careful, too, about how he handles things online. When he's kind of online, he says this about kind of his approach. He says, my wife is tagged in the majority of my posts. My status is listed as married, and interactions online are treated the same way as if in person. I do not follow old girlfriends, as there's a reason that they're in that category, okay? So this kind of fence that he's erected, both kind of practically and then online, has helped, I think, to fuel a very strong marriage. When I asked his wife to kind of rate their marriage on kind of a scale of 1 to 10, she gave their marriage a 10. Of course, the 10 being the best outcome for them. And we do see in the general social survey that Americans who kind of take that classic view about fidelity, that any kind of sex outside of a marriage is always wrong, are markedly happier in their marriages than, unfortunately, the growing numbers of Americans who don't embrace that classic perspective. This is, I think, a consequence of this sort of increasing popularity of polyamory, at least in the, in the culture. And then kind of, I want to also just make the point, too, when it comes to commitment, that we often see in the research on marital happiness that different measures of commitment end up being, the number one predictor of whether or not people are satisfied, in their relationships and in their marriages. So commitment's pretty fundamental to forging not just a stable marriage, but a strong marriage. And the final pillar that I'll mention tonight is about community. And I think when it comes to community, the elite view oftentimes is that one kind of community, religious community, is an obstacle to living your best life and realizing your best love. Again, an obstacle to living your best life and realizing your best love. This kind of came through for me in reading an interview in the New Yorker that was entitled this: A Sociologist of Religion on Protestants, Porn, and the Purity Industrial Complex. It was an interview with a sociologist named Sam Perry. And in this interview with the New Yorker, kind of Perry left us with the impression that evangelical Protestant men who had a kind of more traditional view of sexual morality were kind of guilty over any kind of failures that they had when it came to viewing pornography. And that their wives were especially intolerant of any problems that their husbands had with pornography. And that this community was kind of facing a major problem with not just kind of conflict over this issue, but also with divorce. And then kind of I think the broader takeaway from this interview was basically kind of telling us that religion was an obstacle, again, kind of an obstacle to forging a strong and kind of realistic and sort of happy marriage in the 21st century is kind of the takeaway from this interview. But again, when I kind of talk to ordinary couples, including a couple that I'll call Martin and Kimberly that live, again, actually not too far from here, I had the sense that generally speaking, Christian couples were more likely to be flourishing. And so Martin and Kimberly are an evangelical African-American couple. And when I spoke to Martin about his marriage, he kind of mentioned, for instance, that, when he's on the internet sort of checking out his favorite news and music sites, he's careful. He said to me, it's one of those things where, the Bible's very clear about fleeing temptation, he said, adding, so yeah, certain sites I won't go on. He also talked too about how he kind of checks in on a regular basis with his pastor about sort of how his marriage and family life are going, and that his pastor helps kind of keep him accountable for being both a good husband and an attentive father. And then likewise, Kimberly mentioned that she'd actually had some issues around this issue of sexual intimacy in their marriage early on because she was sexually abused as a child. In her words, but that's how prayer entered, because I had some stuff happen prior to us that made having sex challenging for me. I'm like, okay, God, you're only going to heal me. Only God can really, truly heal this. So both kind of actually through the power of prayer and also some kind of support and advice from some of her fellow parishioners was she kind of able to address this issue. And today both Martin and Kimberly are flourishing in their marriages. And again, this is kind of like a pretty similar pattern that I saw across most religious couples that I spoke with for the book. And Martin and Kimberly, again, they're not outliers. What we see in my survey work with Wendy Wang is that religious couples are markedly more likely to say that they're happily married compared to couples who are not religious. About, you can see here, it's about 15 percentage points difference. This is a large difference, statistically speaking. We can see also when it comes to divorce, that kind of the New Yorker's insinuation that divorce is more common among Christian couples is not borne out by a lot of different evidence. This is from Tyler Vanderweel at Harvard. And what he's doing here is tracking a very large sample of women across the US over time and finding that women who are religious, who are active churchgoers, about 47% less likely to get divorced than their female peers who are not religious. And there's other kind of work that tells us a rather similar story about the links between regular church going and lower divorce rates across the US. And then too, I think what's kind of striking too is that when you look at actual reports of both sexual frequency and sexual satisfaction in more recent data, including a YouGov survey that I did with my colleague, Dr. Wendy Wang, this runs kind of right against the kind of insinuations of the New Yorker, is that today, really for I think probably the first time in recent years, we're seeing that sexual frequency is markedly more common among religious couples compared to secular couples. So we see in this new survey that we're analyzing with YouGov that about 2/3 of religious couples have sex at least once a week who are married. And that compares to less than half of secular couples. Really kind of surprising. This is a newer development. We see this also in the general social survey, this kind of growing gap between sexual frequency between the religious folks and the folks who are secular. And then not surprising, we see it for the average couples who are religious, there's more sexual satisfaction compared to secular couples. So again, these are the kinds of findings that the New Yorker was obviously not platforming in that interview. And they run right against the kind of, I think, conclusions you might otherwise draw from that New Yorker interview. Now, I want to be kind of careful here to acknowledge that if you think carefully about my slide just I'll just go back to it 2 times ago. I'm showing that regular church-going husbands and wives are markedly more happy than their more secular peers, but obviously not everyone is very happy when we did this survey back in 2022. And I've also seen some other work as well that about 1 in 5 regular churchgoers, particularly wives more than husbands, are not happy at any one point in time, in their marriage. So I don't want to kind of minimize the reality that kind of on any given Sunday, there are going to be both husbands and especially wives who are more likely to be struggling in their marriage. And we need to be kind of attentive of that reality, and we need to kind of preach and teach with an eye towards the fact that there are folks, in the pews who are struggling in their marriages. But I also don't want to kind of minimize the reality that on average, both husbands and wives who are connected to their church communities are more likely to be flourishing. They're more likely to be forging strong and stable and sexually satisfied marriages in America today in ways that often I think our media and our academic students of the family don't appreciate or don't report. And that's because I think the kind of familistic virtues, values, and social networks that are typically supplied by churches tend to, on average, foster stronger marriages and stronger families across the country. And that's, again, part of the good news that I'm sharing with you tonight. And then kind of the final piece of, in a sense, good news that I'm sharing with you tonight is that when it comes to kind of not just this question of who is doing reasonably well on the family front, but also thinking about kind of who is most likely to be kind of succeeding in that classic Jeffersonian pursuit, the pursuit of happiness. What we see is that religious Americans today are much more likely to be realizing that Jeffersonian pursuit, that religious Americans are more likely to say that they're very happy with their lives, as this figure here indicates, compared to their peers who are not religious. So about 25% of religious Americans say that they're very happy, compared to just 14% of secular Americans. The intermediate category here is pretty happy. You kind of can do the numbers if you'd like to. And you can see too, when it comes to the worst category in the GSS, reporting you're not too happy, that secular Americans, again, are markedly more likely to say that they're not too happy with their lives compared to religious Americans. So there's a way in which religion is linked for many Americans to that pursuit of happiness. When you kind of look in more detail at this sort of religion and happiness story, what you find is that about a third of this association can be explained by the fact that religious Americans are more likely to be married in the first place and then happily married in the second place. So again, one reason why religious Americans are more likely to be flourishing in the United States today is that they're more likely to be also doing pretty well on the marriage and family front. And that's good news as well. Okay, so let me conclude by suggesting to you that we need to do a better job of forging a kind of marriage mindset and kind of dispensing with the Midas mindset that I began my talk covering. And to revive this kind of marriage mindset, we need to, I think, both reform our existing institutions, both in terms of universities and colleges on the one hand, but also in terms of the media as well, kind of to convey a more truthful story about kind of the value of marriage and family for kids and for adults across the country. We need to build new institutions that are dedicated to forging strong and stable families. And we need to expand the work of existing civic and religious efforts to strengthen marriage across America. I'm thinking of kind of really 4 steps more concretely that we should do with greater confidence and greater courage as well. And so the first step is to do more when it comes to family life education, both in Catholic schools and in Catholic youth groups, okay? To kind of convey some of the kinds of insights that were spoken of tonight in more concrete and compelling ways in classrooms and in Catholic youth groups, serving both high school students and college students as well. I think the second thing that we should do is to kind of be more engaged in a constructive way in social media, kind of talking about all the ways in which, many of our Catholic teachings relating to marriage and family are associated with flourishing, with human flourishing for both men and for women. The third thing is to be kind of more intentional about family ministry, and we've seen new groups like Communio. It's a new family ministry headquartered just across the Potomac in Alexandria that is working with churches across the country, both Protestant and Catholic, to kind of increase the quality of marriage and family ministry in churches around the U.S. And then finally, do you think about forming more civic initiatives like the San Antonio Marriage Initiative that are giving couples, both who are preparing for marriage and couples who are struggling in their marriages, more support, more resources to forge strong and stable marriages in their local communities. So taking steps like these could not be more important, because forming men and women to live out a life dedicated to making a gift of themselves to others in the context of family and preparing the next generation to do likewise is the best path, I think, to reviving that most important Jeffersonian pursuit, the pursuit of happiness. So with that, I thank you. So I'm happy to take questions about both the presentation and then the book more generally.
Is it possible that J.D. Vance got a bad rap for his childless cat lady's remark? Is it possible he said it badly, but he's saying some of the same things you are?
Yeah, that's a provocative question to start off our Q&A here with. But so yeah, what I would say is that, putting this more positively, what we have seen in recent years is that a lot of younger women think that marriage and motherhood are a bad deal for them. And that the kinds of sentiments that I began articulating in terms of that Bloomberg story and that New York Times op-ed are emblematic of the way in which a lot of younger women are thinking about kind of marriage and family life today. And yet what they don't realize and don't appreciate is that on average, women who are married are more likely to be happy than women who are single. And there's no group of women in the prime years of their lives between 18 and 55 who are happier on average than married mothers. And so as difficult as both marriage and motherhood can be for women, it's important, I think, just to get people to realize that, generally speaking, we see is that married moms are less lonely, they report more meaningful lives, and they're happier. And then when it comes to kind of both household income and when it comes to sort of assets as they head in towards retirement in their 50s, women who are stably married are just in a much better financial position than their fellow female peers who are not either stably married or ever married. So a lot of the assumptions about, again, kind of marriage being, in a sense, a path to misery and immiseration that we would sort of see articulated on social media today, and then also in the media, don't dovetail with the data. So in a constructive way, I think we need to do more to help young women understand that in general, marriage and family life are a path to flourishing and not to floundering.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very insightful. I'm wondering if your research has delved into the happiness of same-sex couples.
My research has not focused on that question. I have seen research indicating that same-sex couples who are married are also happier than same-sex adults who are not married. So that's what I've seen from that research in terms of that particular question. Yep.
Thank you for coming. You mentioned the unencumbered self and the pursuit of mammon in obviously a negative way, a problematic ideal. You also quote this pursuit of happiness, Jefferson's stand-in for the pursuit of property in Locke. But can families ever prosper within like a regime that denies the fundamental encumberdness? Obviously, he talked about Aristotle as well, the social animality and the familial aspect that is to be human. It seems like all societies that are downstream from this Enlightenment, like liberal idea, kind of have to hold that, right? That unencumberedness. And so in short, like, can the heart of America really be opened because of our cultural and political history of individualism as this top ideal? Thank you.
Good question. I mean, I think, as we think about kind of at least sort of the earlier decades, sort of towards the beginning of the founding of the nation, we had a more kind of communitarian, ethos that sort of shaped American life. And I think, a less individualistic ethos. And so in that sense, it was easier in some important ways to forge strong and stable families. And by contrast, in this moment, really especially since the late 1960s, we've been kind of living in a much more individualistic era. Now, whether or not we want to trace that back to, figures like Locke or, other figures in that modern time period, that certainly, I think, we could do that, but I think it's also important to recognize and realize that we're kind of struggling when it comes to sort of forming families across the globe. And so I think to suggest that this is kind of a uniquely American problem that could be kind of traced back to, in some ways, to the founding or to some of the thinkers that shaped the founding, doesn't seem to really kind of dovetail with the fact that, the family is struggling across the globe, from Japan to Tunisia, to Turkey, to Sweden, to the US. There's something kind of, unfolding across the globe that certainly I think can be linked to certain kind of Western understandings of individualism, but is also larger than just simply that particular cultural inheritance.
Thank you. I'd like to invite you to comment a little bit more about your point in one of the last slides about reforming institutions, and particularly I'm thinking about higher ed, ways in which we can make higher ed more family-minded. I'm dating myself, but I remember when I was in college, there was a letter written in the Daily Princetonian. Maybe some of you may remember this.
Right.
Yes.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
And
that mother?
It was Princeton mom.
Yes. Yeah.
Advising the young women of Princeton to find a husband while in college, right? That there was something wise about this. I actually tried to look up the article online. It seems like the Daily Princetonian has removed it from their website. But you can find the pieces in the Atlantic responding to it, but not the original. And I mean, I'm a professor. I often get questions about, marriage, how to, lead a good life. And my answer is always think about the kind of person that you want to be. Form yourself with prudence and with virtue. And that seems to be something that's often not brought up in these discussions, whether it's for the trad right online saying women should get married by a certain age, or by those who want to raise the birth rate saying it might be good for, families to begin at earlier times in their 20s, sure. Something like this. So I would just like to invite you to comment on what kinds of institutions, whether it's higher ed or others, could be reformed in a way to encourage this marriage mindset, and then how do we encourage young people to develop the sets of virtues that make them the kind of person that someone would want to be friends with and maybe marry?
Great question. So I think a couple of thoughts on that question. The first thing that I would say is helping young adults understand and appreciate how much marriage matters and family matters, both for adults, and then also for kids as well, on the marriage piece. And then the second thing that I would say is equipping them with a certain set of virtues that would help them kind of navigate relationships more successfully in terms of, and there are actually some very good programs that help to kind of teach people how to deal with things like conflict and communication more successfully. And I think that's certainly helpful for couples who are both dating and then couples who are married as well. So in other words, it's not just enough to kind of teach them that marriage matters, but kind of to equip them with some of the virtues that will make it easier to forge a good marriage as well and a good dating relationship as well. I think too, in this particular context that we're living in, one needs to be also more intentional about kind of encouraging college students to date, and to be as kind of intentional about their dating relationships as they are about often their education and their career. I was speaking to an RA of mine last year at UVA, for instance, and kind of asking him about his plans for the future. And he had a very clear sense of what he wanted to do for graduate school and how he wanted to kind of, navigate professional life for the next decade. And then I asked him, would you like to get married? And he said, yes, I would. I'm like, well, what's your plan for marriage? And there was complete silence. Okay, so he hadn't really thought through well, I'm single right now, and I would like to be, married at some point, relatively soon down the road. How do I go from being single to being married, right? And so just to kind of do more to encourage young adults, both here, at a college, university like CUA, and other places across the U.S. to sort of, give our young adults kind of as much motivation around sort of dating and marriage as they already have around oftentimes, their education and their future, future career would be, I think, helpful as well. Those are some of the things that we could do to, I think, create a cultural context and some wisdom, both about kind of the global picture and then also kind of the skills they need to have themselves to have more success in this arena.
Thank you very much, Professor Wilcox. Really appreciated this information and your gloss on it. You mentioned at the end, in terms of suggestions for trying to draw people more towards married life and pursuing happiness in that way, a lot of more intermediate institutions call them, universities, church communities that have been mentioned previously. I don't know if you have any thoughts about potential policy prescriptions at the federal or the state level that might help people feel more able to have to form families, to get married, to have children. I think it's my understanding that surveys have consistently shown that people are having fewer children than they would like more often than was the case previously. People feel like it's harder financially to make marriage and family happen for them. So I don't know if you had any thoughts on the policy side of this in terms of making it easier for people potentially.
Yeah, good question. So there is a new initiative at the Institute for Family Studies called the Pro-Natalist Initiative that my colleague Lyman Stone is heading up. And he's thinking a lot about policies that are going to make it easier for Americans, among others, to kind of go ahead and form the families that they would like to have. And he's also kind of shown empirically that a lot of women, end their reproductive years not having the number of kids that they had hoped to have. So it's kind of a real issue. But in terms of kind of more concrete policies that I think would be helpful, both in terms of family formation, in terms of marriage, I would say two, among others, come to mind kind of right away. And one is that we're right now penalizing marriage for a lot of working class families when it comes to both, especially Medicaid and food stamps and the earned income tax credit. And that's kind of a complex issue in some ways, but just we could, I think, address that by just changing basically the thresholds for married couples with kids versus single parents in ways that would really end that marriage penalty that faces a lot of working class couples with kids today. So that's, I think, one thing that we could do. I think the second big challenge facing us, and this is really a challenge facing us on a number of different fronts, is confronting the cost of housing, which obviously has grown immensely in the last decade even. And so there, I think it's about, in part, kind of rolling back needless regulations in localities. It's about trying to identify, maybe new plots of land the federal government kind of currently controls. So right now, the federal government basically controls 28% of all the land in the country. And so I would love for, the next administration, for instance, they seem to be fond of executive orders, these days, and, Republican and Democratic administrations. Well, let's do some executive orders, like just opening up, 1% of federal land to kind of building on a pretty massive basis, towns and cities across the U.S. And I think you could do that in a way that would be kind of increasing the supply of especially single-family housing for working and middle-class Americans potentially as well. I mean, there are other things you could do on the housing front, but those are kind of, two examples of things that might be helpful in increasing the supply of housing in ways that would make, family formation easier, particularly for working and middle-class Americans. So those are some of the kind of policy ideas that we could be thinking about to make both marriage and family life more accessible. At the same time, I don't want to kind of overplay, and kind of ironically here in DC, right, but overplay the policy card, because I think many of us thought that a country like Hungary, for instance, that has kind of pursued, policies in a very vigorous way on both the marriage and the fertility fronts would see bigger successes than it has. Now, it could be that these kind of policies in Hungary, for instance, will take some time to kind of really take hold. But we've seen not just in Hungary, but in many other countries that kind of dramatic efforts to increase, especially the fertility rate, whether it's in South Korea or in Japan or in Hungary or elsewhere, haven't met with much success. So I think policies are certainly part of the puzzle, especially in terms of making family life more affordable for people who are interested in having kids or expanding their families. But I think the cultural challenges facing us are pretty important. I've touched on them a little bit tonight. And I think, too, just thinking about ways, too, to protect ourselves and then our children, especially from kind of the power of what I call electronic opiates, in my presentation tonight is going to be pretty, important in terms of trying to kind of steer us in a more family-friendly direction going forward.
Thank you for your presentation. On the subject of finances, one thing that prevents many couples, young couples, from getting married is concerns about the costs of marriage, and in particular, the costs of having children. What would you say to encourage those couples?
In terms of just kind of the handling the costs of having kids?
Could be that, could be a mindset with approach, going out into the unknown, but are there ways, for instance, especially working class couples that might not have, deep pockets to get married and have children, what would you say to encourage them?
So I do think, on the policy front, this is kind of one more policy that's worth mentioning tonight. I think there are challenges that are particularly salient for working class couples. I mentioned kind of the marriage penalties they often face in terms of things like Medicaid, for instance, and food stamps, as well as the earned income tax credit. I also think, too, that we could and should expand the child tax credit in ways that would make, the burdens of raising kids, especially for working class couples, lighter. But I also think, too, it's important to kind of stress the value of, recognizing that if you're really intentional about, focusing on your family and kind of living modestly, that there are certainly in many places, although obviously DC represents a higher hurdle than some other places, but in many places you can do that as long as your expectations for your lifestyle are pretty modest, and kind of compared to how many of our grandparents and great grandparents lived. If you have kind of more modest expectations about the size of your apartment or home, the character of your car or truck, how much you really need to rely upon the latest, smartphone, that there are ways to kind of make family life, and also when it comes to eating out as well, too, that if you kind of minimize, a certain set of things, you can make family life more affordable. So that's part of the message we need to kind of be sharing, but also to appreciate, too, that there could be more, I think, where the government could kind of step up and make particularly working class family life more affordable by doing things like expanding the child tax credit in ways that both, Vice President Harris and Senator Vance have, in their own distinct ways, kind of discussed in the last month and a half. So.
Hello, Professor. Thank you very much for coming. My question concerns sort of the messaging within the culture regarding marriage, particularly on maybe the more conservative side. But is it possible to over-idealize marriage? Because I think one thing I've observed is that many young women, they turn on social media, they see all their friends having these fairy tale weddings, and they think, well, someday my Prince Charming will come. Young man turns on his Facebook, sees his friends getting fairy tale weddings, says someday Princess Aurora is going to come, and that's obviously somewhat unrealistic. And I mean, I guess my real question is what should the messaging be on places like social media and other places, if social media is even useful at all, maybe for this purpose, for showing people to take the bitter with the sweet, and realizing that the way that you're going to give yourself a higher chance at this, a higher chance at happiness, is not over idealizing this either.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I do have a chapter in the book called The Soulmate Myth, and I kind of talk in that chapter about the ways in which kind of taking an overly romanticized understanding or approach to marriage is not the right way to do things, and often will kind of lead people to kind of profound dissatisfaction and even to divorce court if they have kind of a needlessly romantic view of marriage. And we should instead kind of think about the way in which, obviously St. Thomas Aquinas talks about love as doing the good of the other, and kind of understanding and appreciating that marriage is fundamentally about kind of pursuing both the good of one's spouse, and then when you have kids, if you have kids, their goods as well, and that's kind of a more kind of appropriate and realistic understanding of what kind of marriage is about. And then, of course, people who generally approach marriage in that way also actually tend to be happier. So there's a kind of satisfaction that comes from both being a good spouse and being a good parent, and then it tends to also kind of, in most marriages and most families, kind of foster a virtuous cycle where your generosity and your service in marriage, I'm not saying always, but generally tends to kind of lead your spouse to respond in a similar fashion, and then you tend to have kids who are more likely to be, generally speaking, most of the time, flourishing and happy kids as well. So, but I think it does require us to realize that an overly romanticized view of marriage is going to be oftentimes counterproductive. And in terms of social media, on that particular point, there's a couple, for instance, at Benedictine College out in Kansas, who've been doing a fair bit of, I think, work on social media. And one of their kind of basically strategies is to kind of share, kind of not relentlessly and all the time, but certainly some of the moments, in their marriage and family life where things are not going well. And so she's kind of like got little basically video snippets where her kids are going crazy, and she's just kind of making the point, like, we're not kind of trying to put this fake kind of view of our family out for the public who's kind of interested in learning about marriage and family, but we're kind of putting a more realistic view of marriage and family to kind of give people a sense of like the highs and the lows, and in so doing kind of equip them for the reality of marriage and family life. But also, ultimately this is a kind of a positive story that they're putting out, on social media. And again, I'm just saying that right now, a lot of young adults, especially younger women, have a very negative view of marriage and motherhood, and they're unaware of the fact that in general and on average, both married moms and married dads are doing a lot better than, their single and childless, both female and male peers. And I think this is where I think people who are kind of more adept at social media could kind of play a role in helping to educate other young adults about the value of marriage and family life. But one more question here.
Thank you very much for your presentation tonight. We're about 50 years or so into like commonplace divorce, and coming from a family that's like broken by divorce, you have the sense that like a happy marriage isn't even really a possibility. It's not something you can really imagine. In your research, when you've looked at like the happily married couples or even marriage formation, are you breaking down things by whether those people came out of households with divorce versus out of married, stayed together? What sort of differences are there maybe?
Yeah, this is a great question to sort of end off our kind of more public conversation on, in terms of one of the points that I didn't quite fully kind of cover in terms of the beginning of my remarks is just, I think sort of the power of someone like Andrew Tate is kind of derived in part from this idea that, most marriages today end in divorce. And so for that reason, because also most divorces are issued by women, marriage is kind of is a bad deal for men today. But when you kind of look at the trends in divorce and then the research on divorce, what you see is a couple of things that I think are in some ways more hopeful. The first thing that I would say is that Divorce has come down since 1980 by about 40%, and so it's not the case anymore that 1 in 2 marriages end in divorce. It's probably closer to 39 or 40%. So it's not 1 in 2. I mean, it's not perfect, but it's better than it was, back in the 70s and early 80s, at kind of the height of the divorce revolution. But it's also kind of important to acknowledge, kind of per your question, that young adults who've come from homes, marked by divorce, are more likely themselves to divorce. And so one way just to kind of minimize that risk, though, is to kind of marry someone who herself or himself comes from an intact family. So as a couple kind of moves into a challenging moment in their marriage, there's at least one party, in the marriage who's kind of has in their head and their heart kind of like they've been through tough times, they've seen their parents navigate them successfully. And so when they're in a kind of a tough moment or a tough chapter in their marriage, they're more likely to be able to help, their spouse navigate it successfully. So that's kind of one kind of piece of advice for people who've come from a home that's been marked by divorce. If you can, find someone who is coming from a stable marriage, and your odds of succeeding are going to be higher. But it's also important to note too that there are other things that I see in my research that are linked to greater marital stability, even for folks who are coming from some kind of family instability or dysfunction. And those are things like, shared church going, which I touched on tonight in my presentation. So that's, one way to kind of, minimize your risk of divorce. A second thing that we see is that men who are stably employed full-time have markedly lower risks of divorce as well. So kind of just reminding and encouraging, men as they're getting married and then as they're in the middle of a marriage to be pretty intentional about their approach to paid work. That's pretty important, even in 2024. We see also that things like regular date nights, where couples are kind of taking time to cultivate that sense of communion that I touched on in my presentation, seem to be protective too against divorce. So there are kind of things that couples can do to minimize the risk of ending up getting divorced. And I think it's important for us to kind of share those pieces of wisdom to kind of both give young adults some hope about marriage, and then to give couples, who are in the middle of a marriage, some touch points that they can kind of turn to forge not just a stable marriage, but of course a strong marriage as well. So I'm happy to answer kind of questions informally, but thank you very much for hosting me here tonight, IHE and COA. It's good to be here.